My name is Sophie Dubois, and my story begins at a business conference in Paris. It was a cold November day, and the grey skies of the French capital seemed to reflect my mood. I was exhausted, stressed by the presentation I had to give later that day. Who could have guessed that this day would change my life forever? I headed for the buffet to pour myself a cup of coffee, hoping that the caffeine would clear the fog that enveloped my mind. That's when I heard a deep, warm voice behind me. "Excuse me, miss, could you pass the sugar?" I turned and met the most captivating gaze I'd ever seen. Deep green eyes, a charming smile, and a presence that seemed to light up the whole room. It was him, Pierre Leroy. "Of course," I replied, handing him the sugar bowl, trying to hide my sudden confusion. "Thank you so much. I don't think I've seen you at these conferences before. Is this your first time?" I laughed softly. "No, I don't. I come regularly, but I generally try to keep a low profile." "Well, that's too bad," he replied with a wink. "Someone like you shouldn't hide." We continued chatting for what seemed like hours, completely oblivious to the conference going on around us. Pierre was fascinating, intelligent and funny. He worked for a large consulting firm, and his passion for his job was contagious. At the end of the day, we exchanged numbers and promised to meet again soon. I floated home that evening on a cloud, unable to think of anything but Pierre and our chance encounter. The next few days were like a whirlwind. Pierre called me the very next day, and we started seeing each other regularly. Our dates were magical. Dinners in little hidden restaurants in Montmartre, moonlit walks along the Seine, visits to museums where we spent hours discussing art and culture. Over time, however, I began to notice certain signs that gave me pause. Pierre often talked about his family, their wealth, their social status. At first, I didn't pay much attention, too absorbed by my budding feelings. But little by little, his comments began to make me feel uncomfortable. One evening, while we were dining in a Michelin-starred restaurant, Pierre made a remark that made me sit up and take notice. "You know, Sophie, my family has always placed a lot of importance on appearances and social status. It's sometimes a bit burdensome, but it's our tradition." I nodded, not sure how to respond. It was then that I made a decision that would have unexpected consequences. I wouldn't tell him about my own professional situation. You see, I was the founder and CEO of a fast-growing technology company. My company had over 400 employees and was on its way to becoming one of the most promising startups in France. But I wanted Pierre to love me for who I was, not for my success or my bank account. So I started playing a role. When Pierre asked me what I did for a living, I would reply vaguely that I worked in tech, without giving any further details. I wore simple clothes on our dates, carefully avoiding any outward sign of wealth. Our relationship continued to blossom, and I fell more and more in love with Pierre. But at the same time, I felt increasingly uncomfortable with my secret. Every time Pierre mentioned his family or their privileged lifestyle, I could feel a knot forming in my stomach. One day, about 3 months after we'd met, Pierre invited me to spend the weekend at his family's country house in Normandy. I accepted with joy, but also with some trepidation. How would her family perceive me? And how was I going to manage my secret in such an intimate environment? The weekend arrived, and we set off for Normandy in Pierre's luxury car. On the way, he told me about his family, their expectations, their history. "You'll see, Sophie, my parents are a little traditional, but I'm sure they'll adore you." I smiled weakly, feeling my heart race. When we arrived in front of the imposing family mansion, I gasped. It was a huge estate, with gardens as far as the eye could see and architecture that screamed old fortune. Pierre's parents greeted us on the front porch. His mother, Elizabeth, was an elegant woman in her 50s, with piercing eyes and a polite but distant smile. Her father, Francois, was an imposing man with a stern face softened by kind eyes. "Welcome, Sophie," Elizabeth said, kissing me on the cheeks. "We're delighted to meet you at last." The weekend passed in a strange atmosphere. I was constantly on my guard, trying not to betray my secret while trying to fit into this world that was totally foreign to me. Conversations revolved around subjects that made me uncomfortable: the family's latest acquisitions, their trips to exclusive destinations, their relationships with influential personalities. On Sunday evening, as we prepared to leave for Paris, Elizabeth pulled me aside. "Sophie, my dear, I hope you had a good weekend with us." "Yes, thank you very much for your hospitality," I replied politely. She looked at me intensely, as if trying to break through my defenses. "You know, our family has a certain position to maintain. I hope you understand how important that is to Pierre and to us." I felt my heart clench. Was it a warning? A warning? I didn't have time to think about it any further, because Pierre arrived, putting an end to our conversation. On the way back to Paris, I was silent, lost in thought. Pierre must have sensed my confusion because he put his hand on mine. "Are you all right, Sophie? You seem preoccupied." I forced a smile. "Everything's fine, I'm just a little tired." But deep down, I knew things were about to get complicated. My secret was getting heavier and heavier, and I was beginning to wonder how much longer I could keep it. Elizabeth's attitude had made me realize that Pierre's family had very specific expectations, and I wasn't sure I could meet them, either as a simple employee or as a CEO. That weekend in Normandy marked a turning point in our relationship. I loved Pierre deeply, but I was beginning to realize that our history was built on a lie, however well-intentioned. How could I build a future with him if I couldn't be honest about who I really was? As we approached Paris, the city lights glittering in the night, I made a decision. I had to tell Pierre the truth, whatever the consequences. But little did I know that fate was going to force my hand in a way I could never have imagined. The weeks following our weekend in Normandy flew by. Pierre and I were closer than ever, but my secret weighed more and more heavily on my conscience. Every time we talked about our future, I felt a lump form in my throat. How could I contemplate a life together based on a lie? It was in this frame of mind that I received a call from Pierre one Wednesday evening, as I was leaving the office late. "Sophie, darling," his voice was playful on the phone. "My parents are having a family dinner this Saturday night and they insist you come. Are you free?" My heart began to race. Family dinner? At his parents'? In Paris? The idea terrified me, but I couldn't refuse. "Of course, Pierre. I'll be delighted to come," I replied, trying to mask my apprehension. "Perfect. I'll pick you up at 7 p.m. "Oh, and Sophie, my mother insisted it be a dressy evening. Do you have anything appropriate?" I glanced at my mental wardrobe. Sure, I had lavish evening wear worthy of my CEO status. But I couldn't wear them without arousing suspicion. "Don't worry, I'll think of something," I assured Pierre. Saturday evening arrived far too quickly for my liking. I'd opted for a simple but elegant black dress, bought especially for the occasion in a ready-to-wear boutique. A far cry from my usual designer outfits, but chic enough not to stand out. Pierre picked me up at the appointed hour, resplendent in his tailor-made suit. "You're beautiful," he said, kissing me tenderly. The drive to his parents' apartment in the 16th arrondissement was a tense silence. I had a feeling that this evening was going to be decisive, one way or another. The Leroy's apartment was exactly as I'd imagined it, spacious, luxurious, with a breathtaking view of the Eiffel Tower. Works of art adorned the walls, and the furniture looked like it had come straight out of a high-end design catalogue. Elizabeth greeted us, resplendent in a burgundy cocktail dress. "Sophie, my dear, what a pleasure to see you again," she said, kissing me on the cheeks. Her expensive perfume enveloped me, painfully reminding me of the gulf that seemed to separate us. Dinner began in a hushed atmosphere. The conversation revolved around the Leroy family's latest acquisitions, their plans for a vacation in their villa in Saint-Tropez, and Pierre's professional exploits. I just listened, intervening politely when asked a question, trying not to betray my discomfort. It was at dessert time that things took an unexpected turn. Elizabeth turned to me, her gaze suddenly more piercing. "Sophie, dear, Pierre told us you work in technology. How fascinating. Could you tell us more about your work?" I felt all eyes turn to me. Pierre gave me an encouraging smile. I took a deep breath, ready to serve up my usual evasive speech about my alleged mid-range startup job. But before I could respond, Elizabeth followed up with, "I hope this isn't too indiscreet, but I've done some research on you. My blood ran cold through my veins. Had she discovered the truth? I must admit I'm a little disappointed, she continued, her tone turning colder. You understand, Sophie, our family has a certain reputation to maintain. We've been part of Parisian high society for generations. And although Pierre seems very smitten with you, I wonder if you're really living up to our expectations. A stony silence fell over the table. I could feel Pierre's shocked look, his father's embarrassment, and Elizabeth's icy determination. Mother, exclaimed Pierre, but Elizabeth silenced him with a wave of her hand. No, Pierre. It's time we had that conversation. Sophie, dear, she turned to me, her gaze hard as steel. This family is the elite. We don't accept ordinary people here. I hope you understand. The shock took my breath away. I knew Elizabeth was a snob, but I'd never imagined such cruelty. Words failed me for a moment, as I digested the thinly veiled insult. Pierre seemed about to explode in anger, but I beat him to it. Part of me wanted to reveal the truth right away, to show them how wrong they were. But another, more rational part of me knew it wasn't the right time. Madame Leroy, I began, my voice surprisingly calm despite the storm raging inside me. I understand your concern for your son and your family. But I think you're making a grave mistake by judging people solely on their apparent social status. Elizabeth gave a condescending chuckle. My dear, you are young. You don't yet understand how our world works. I felt anger rising in me, but I contained it. Maybe it's you who doesn't understand how the modern world works, Madame Leroy. A person's worth is not measured by their bank account or their family name. Pierre put his hand on mine, giving me a look mixed with pride and concern. His father, Francois, looked uncomfortable, but didn't dare intervene. Elizabeth, for her part, seemed increasingly annoyed. Listen, Sophie. Let me get this straight. This family is elite. We don't accept poor people here. If you really care about Pierre, you'll understand that your presence could compromise his future. Those words were like a stab. I looked at Pierre, searching his eyes for a reaction, for support. He seemed paralyzed, torn between his love for me and his respect for his family. It was then that I made a decision. I couldn't go on like this. The lie, the cover-up, it all had to end. No matter what the consequences. I stood up slowly, all eyes on me. Madame Leroy, Monsieur Leroy, Pierre. I think it's time I was perfectly honest with all of you. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of my secret lighten as I prepared to reveal it. The truth is. But before I could finish my sentence, a sound of breaking glass echoed in the next room, followed by a muffled swear word. We all froze, startled by this unexpected interruption. Francois stood up hurriedly. That must be Marie, the new cleaning lady. I'll go and see what's going on. This brief interlude broke the tension in the dining room. Elizabeth excused herself to go and check the damage, leaving Pierre and me alone at the table. Pierre grabbed my hand, his eyes full of remorse. Sophie, I'm so sorry. I never thought my mother would go this far. What she said was unforgivable. I squeezed his hand in return, my heart racing. Pierre, there's something I have to tell you. Something I should have told you a long time ago. But before I could continue, Elizabeth returned, looking visibly upset. That cleaning lady is clumsy. She broke the china vase your grandmother gave us, Pierre. The atmosphere grew tense again. I knew it wasn't the ideal moment for my revelation, but I also felt that if I didn't do it now, I might never have the courage again. I took a deep breath, ready to reveal everything, when suddenly, the moment had come. My heart was beating so fast I was sure everyone could hear it. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of my secret lighten as I prepared to reveal it. Madame Leroy, Monsieur Leroy, Pierre, I began, my voice trembling but determined. There's something you need to know about me. All eyes were on me. Pierre looked at me with a mixture of concern and curiosity, while Elizabeth wore an expression of barely concealed disdain. The truth is, I'm not who you think I am, I continued. I'm not just another employee at a tech startup. In fact, I'm the founder and CEO of Tech Innovate, one of France's hottest tech companies. A dead silence fell over the room. I saw Elizabeth's eyes widen in surprise, while Francois let out a hiccup of amazement. Pierre, for his part, seemed simply stunned. My company employs over 400 people, I continued, gaining confidence as I spoke. We are leaders in the field of artificial intelligence and machine learning. Last year, our sales exceeded 100 million euros. Elizabeth was the first to recover her voice. But that's impossible, she stammered. We've been researching you. How did we miss this? I sketched a sad smile. Because I've made sure of it, Madame Leroy. I deliberately kept a low profile in my personal life. I wanted people, including Pierre, to appreciate me for who I am, not for my success or fortune. Pierre stood up abruptly, almost knocking his chair over. Sophie, why didn't you tell me? Her voice was a mixture of confusion and pain. I'm sorry, Pierre, I replied, tears in my eyes. I was afraid. Afraid that it would change the way you saw me. Afraid you'd think I was only interested in you for your social status. I wanted to make sure that what we had was real. Francois, who had remained silent until then, spoke up. It's remarkable, Sophie. You must be an extraordinary woman to have accomplished all this at your age. Elizabeth seemed to be struggling to assimilate the information. Her face went from surprise to incredulity, then to a kind of reluctant respect. But why did you keep it a secret for so long? She asked, her voice having lost its condescending tone. Because I grew up in a modest environment, Madame Leroy, I explained. I saw how people changed when they learned of my success. I saw friendships break up, relationships become self-serving. I didn't want that to happen with Pierre. I wanted him to love me for me, not for my money or my status. Pierre approached me, taking my hands in his. Sophie, I love you for who you are. Your success doesn't change the way I feel about you. But I don't understand why you didn't trust me. I felt the tears roll down my cheeks. I was wrong, Pierre. I should have trusted you. I was afraid of losing you. Suddenly, a sound of hurried footsteps startled us all. It was Marie, the housekeeper, storming into the dining room, eyes wide. Madam, sir, I'm sorry to interrupt, but you need to see this. She turned on the television hanging on the wall. On the screen, a news anchor announced breaking news. We've just learned that TechInnovate, the French startup specializing in artificial intelligence, has just signed a historic agreement with the French government to develop a new generation of defense systems. The contract, worth several billion euros, propels TechInnovate into the ranks of the world's tech giants. The camera then showed a photo of me, taken at a press conference the previous year. Sophie Dubois, the young CEO of TechInnovate, is now considered one of Europe's most influential female entrepreneurs, the presenter concluded. A stunned silence fell over the room. All eyes were on me again, but this time with a mixture of amazement and admiration. Elizabeth was the first to break the silence. Sophie, I don't know what to say. I owe you an apology. I've been terribly unfair to you. I nodded, accepting his apology without a word. My attention was focused on Pierre, who hadn't said a word since the televised announcement. Pierre, I whispered, fear knotting my stomach. Please say something. He looked at me, his eyes shining with an emotion I couldn't decipher. Then, against all odds, he burst out laughing. Sophie Dubois, he said, shaking his head, a smile on his face. You never cease to amaze me, do you? His laughter was infectious, and soon we were all laughing again, releasing the tension built up over the surreal evening. Once calm had returned, Francois raised his glass. I think a toast is in order. To Sophie, a remarkable woman who has had us all well and truly. We all raised our glasses, even Elizabeth, who seemed to have completely changed her attitude towards me. Later that evening, as Pierre drove me home, we had a long conversation in the car. I understand why you kept it a secret, he told me softly. But I hope that in the future, you'll trust me to love you as you are, with or without your technological empire. I smiled, feeling a huge weight lift from my shoulders. I promise you, Pierre. No more secrets between us. As we pulled up in front of my building, Pierre looked at me with a mixture of admiration and love. You know, I thought I'd impress you with my work and my family. But you're the one who completely dazzled me tonight. I laughed softly. That wasn't my intention, believe me. I just hope it doesn't change anything between us. Pierre kissed me tenderly. It changes everything, Sophie. But for the better. I love you even more now that I really know you. As I climbed the steps to my apartment building, I felt lighter than ever. The secret I'd carried for so long was finally out, and contrary to my worst fears, it had only strengthened my relationship with Pierre. However, part of me couldn't help worrying. How would this revelation affect our long-term relationship? How would Pierre's family really react once the initial shock had worn off? And above all, how was I going to reconcile my newly exposed personal life with the demands of my role as CEO of a fast-growing company? These questions swirled in my mind as I prepared for the night. But for the first time in a long time, I was eager to find out what the future held for Pierre and me, without the weight of secrecy on my shoulders. The days following the revelation were a whirlwind of emotions and events. The news of my identity and Techinovate's government contract spread like wildfire through Parisian media and business circles. My phone was ringing off the hook, my mailbox was overflowing, and journalists were practically camped outside my apartment and the company's offices. On Monday morning, I had to face up to my employees. I called a general meeting, aware that many of them had probably seen the news over the weekend. "Good morning, everyone," I began, standing before the assembly of curious and surprised faces. "I know many of you have questions following the recent revelations in the media. I would like to apologize for the secrecy I have maintained about my personal life. It was not out of any lack of trust in you, but out of a desire to protect my privacy and focus on our work here at Techinnovate." I saw understanding nods among the crowd, which encouraged me to continue. "The government contract you've heard about is real, and it represents an incredible opportunity for our company. But I want you to know that nothing changes in the way we work together. I'm still the same person, and we're still the same dedicated and passionate team." After the meeting, several employees came to see me personally. Some to congratulate me, others to express their surprise, and a few to express their concerns about the future of the company. Mark, my technical director, pulled me aside. "Sophie, I've worked with you since the beginning, and I thought I knew you. How did you manage to hide this for so long?" I sighed. "It wasn't easy, Mark. But I wanted Techinnovate to be judged on its merits, not on my personal history." He nodded, understanding. "I understand. But now that it's all out in the open, how are we going to handle the media pressure? And this government contract, it's huge, Sophie. Are we ready for it?" His questions reflected my own concerns. "We're going to have to adapt quickly," I admitted. "I've already contacted a PR agency to help us manage the media. As for the contract, it's a challenge, but I know our team is up to it." Meanwhile, feedback from Pierre's family continued to come in. Pierre's father Francois called me on Tuesday morning. "Sophie, I just wanted to tell you how impressed I am," he said. "I've been researching your company, and what you've accomplished is remarkable. I'd like to discuss with you potential synergies between Techinnovate and some of our family businesses." I was touched by his enthusiasm, but also a little wary. Was it genuine interest or simply an attempt to take advantage of the situation? "Thank you, Mr. Leroy," I replied politely. "I'd be delighted to discuss this with you in an appropriate professional setting." Elizabeth, for her part, seemed to be having trouble digesting the news. She sent me several messages, oscillating between apologies for her past behavior and clumsy attempts to get closer to me. "My dear Sophie, I hope you can forgive me for my inappropriate words. Perhaps we could have lunch together this week? I'd love to learn more about your fascinating background." I had to take it upon myself not to respond curtly. Instead, I opted for a diplomatic reply, promising to find a moment in my busy schedule to meet her. The hardest thing to deal with was Pierre's reaction. Although he assured me that his feelings for me hadn't changed, I sensed an underlying tension in our interactions. One evening, while we were having dinner at my place, away from prying eyes, Pierre finally expressed what was bothering him. "Sophie, I love you, you know that," he began, nervously playing with his fork. "But I can't help feeling, I don't know, insignificant. You're this incredible businesswoman, this visionary. And me, I'm just. Pierre, stop it, I interrupted, taking his hand in mine. You're not just anything. You're brilliant, compassionate, and have your own successful career. My success in no way diminishes your worth. He smiled weakly. I know it's irrational. But suddenly, all these people looking at you in awe, wanting to talk to you. I wonder what you can see in me. This conversation made me realize how much my revelation had affected our dynamic. We had work to do to regain our balance. Meanwhile, feedback from the outside world continued to pour in. From old classmates to ex-boyfriends to long-forgotten friends, everyone seemed keen to reconnect. One message in particular made me smile bitterly. It was from Thomas, my ex-boyfriend who had left me years ago, telling me I'd never make it in the cutthroat world of business. Sophie, I saw the news. I knew you had potential. Perhaps we could meet again and catch up. I deleted the message without replying, reminding myself why I had chosen to keep my private life so private. As the days went by, I had to juggle managing the sudden growth of TechInnovate, incessant media requests, and attempts to maintain a normal personal life with Pierre. One evening, exhausted after a long day of meetings and interviews, I collapsed on my sofa. Pierre came and sat beside me, handing me a cup of tea. How are you holding up? He asked me softly. I took a sip of tea before answering. Honestly, I don't know. It's all happening so fast. I feel like the whole world wants a piece of me, and I don't know how to deal with it all. Pierre took me in his arms. You're not alone, Sophie. I'm here. We'll get through this together. His words warmed my heart, but part of me couldn't help but worry. How long could Pierre stand this pressure? How long before the novelty of our situation wore off and the reality of living in the shadow of a famous CEO began to weigh on him? The next few weeks were a test for our relationship. We had to learn to navigate this new world where my life was constantly in the spotlight. Pierre had to get used to being introduced as Sophie Dubois' companion at social events, while I had to learn to share aspects of my life that I had kept private for so long. But despite the challenges, there were also moments of pure joy. Like the day I finally got to show Pierre the real TechInnovate offices, not the little co-working space I'd been pretending was my workplace. It's incredible, he whispered as he looked around, wide-eyed at the high-tech labs and modern workspaces. You really built all this. I smiled, proud but also relieved to finally be able to share this part of my life with him. Yes, and now I can finally share it with you. As we stood there, hand in hand, looking at the business I'd built, I realized that despite all the challenges and changes, I was grateful. Grateful for finally being able to be honest, grateful for having Pierre by my side, and grateful for all the opportunities that lay ahead. But a little voice inside me couldn't help but wonder, was this really the end of our trials, or simply the beginning of a new chapter filled with unexpected challenges? The months following the revelation of my identity and the government contract were a period of intense transformation, both for me and for my personal and professional relationships. TechInnovate was growing exponentially. The government contract had catapulted us to international prominence, attracting the attention of the world's leading technology companies. Our workforce had doubled in the space of a few months, and we had to move to larger premises to accommodate our expanding team. However, with this rapid growth came new challenges. There was enormous pressure to deliver the government project on time, while maintaining our corporate culture and innovative spirit. I spent endless days in the office, juggling strategy meetings, brainstorming sessions with the technical team, and countless interviews and press conferences. One evening, as I was coming home late, I found Pierre sitting in the dark in our living room. He was waiting for me, a serious expression on his face. Sophie, we need to talk, he said softly. My heart sank. Those words never boded well. What's going on, Pierre? I asked, sitting down next to him. He took a deep breath before speaking. I love you, Sophie. You know I do. But these last few months, I feel like I'm losing you. You're always at work, and when you're home, you're constantly on your phone or computer. I understand that your business is important, but where do I fit into all this? His words hit me like a punch. I'd been so absorbed in running TechInnovate and my new public life that I'd neglected the person most important to me. Pierre, I'm sorry, I whispered, tears in my eyes. You're right. I've let work get in the way of everything else. But you're the most important thing to me. I promise you I'm going to make some changes. That conversation was a real jolt. I realized that if I wanted our relationship to survive, I had to learn to strike a better balance between my professional and personal life. In the weeks that followed, I made a conscious effort to be more present in our relationship. I started delegating more to my management team, allowing myself to come home earlier. I even took a whole weekend off, my first in months, to take Pierre to a small bed and breakfast in the countryside, away from phones and computers. During the weekend, we had long conversations about our future. Pierre confided in me his worries about his place in my life, now that I'd become a public figure. Sometimes I feel like I'm just Sophie Dubois's boyfriend, you know, he admitted. I'm proud of you and all you've accomplished, but I don't want to lose my identity in the process. His words made me realize that I wasn't the only one going through a period of transformation. Pierre, too, had to adapt to our new reality. You're so much more than that to me, Pierre, I replied, squeezing his hand. You're my anchor, my support. Without you, I wouldn't be where I am today. Maybe we could find ways for you to get more involved in some aspect of my work. Not as an employee, but as a partner. This idea seemed to intrigue her, and we spent the rest of the weekend brainstorming ways to better integrate our personal and professional lives. Back in Paris, I implemented several changes in my professional life. I set up a charitable foundation linked to TechInnovate, focusing on technology education for disadvantaged young people, and invited Pierre to sit on the board. This gave him a significant role in my work, while allowing him to pursue his own career. On the family side, things have changed too. My parents, who were initially overwhelmed by the sudden media attention, eventually adapted to my newfound fame. My mother once told me, you know, Sophie, at first I was worried about all this attention. But now I see how gracefully you're handling it all. I'm so proud of you. Pierre's family has also undergone its own transformation. Elizabeth, my once scornful mother-in-law, went to great lengths to repair our relationship. One day, she invited me to her home for tea, alone. Sophie, she began, clearly uncomfortable, I'd like to sincerely apologize for my past behavior. I was arrogant and narrow-minded. Seeing all you've accomplished, and the way you handle your success with humility, made me realize how wrong I was. I was touched by her sincerity. Thank you, Elizabeth. It means a lot to me. I hope we can move forward and build a better relationship. From that moment on, our interactions became warmer and more genuine. Elizabeth even became involved with TechInnovate's charitable foundation, bringing her fundraising expertise to the table. On the professional front, TechInnovate continued to flourish. The government project was successfully delivered, opening the door to new contracts and partnerships. But this time, I was determined not to let the company's success overshadow my personal life. I introduced more flexible working policies for all employees, encouraging a better work-life balance. I even introduced quarterly family days, where employees were encouraged to bring their loved ones into the office for fun and educational activities. A year after the revelation that had changed everything, Pierre and I found ourselves on the terrace of our new apartment overlooking the Seine. The sun was setting over Paris, bathing the city in golden light. If someone had told me a year ago where we'd be today, I'd never have believed it, Pierre said, pulling me into his arms. I smiled, thinking back to all we'd been through. I wouldn't either. But I wouldn't change a thing. All these trials have made us stronger. Pierre pulled a small box from his pocket. My heart stopped as he got down on one knee. Sophie Dubois, he said, his eyes shining with emotion, you're the most extraordinary woman I've ever met. You've taught me that true love transcends titles, money, and social status. Will you marry me? With tears in my eyes, I nodded, unable to speak. As he slipped the ring onto my finger, I realized that all the hardships we'd been through had been worth it. We had grown together, overcome the obstacles, and emerged stronger on the other side. The experience taught me some valuable lessons. I learned the importance of honesty, even when it's difficult. I learned that professional success is worthless without strong personal relationships to anchor it. And most of all, I learned that true love can weather any storm, as long as you're willing to work to preserve it. As we watched the sun set over Paris, hand in hand, I felt grateful. Grateful for the challenges that had made us stronger, grateful for the people who had supported us, and grateful for the bright future that lay ahead. Our story was not over. In fact, a new chapter was just beginning. But this time, we were ready to face it together, with no secrets, armed with everything we'd learned. And as the last rays of sunlight disappeared over the horizon, I knew with certainty that whatever the future held, Pierre and I could face it together.